Hey, what's up guys? Today I just wanted to do a kind of a follow-up to my Canon 5DS review. I think that because of the way that I reviewed the lens and because of the way some other people have reviewed the lens, I think that it's created a little bit of confusion, especially for new photographers. In many of the reviews, we've talked about how heavily you can crop with the 5DS, and it is remarkable because of the amount of resolution that you can get out of that imaging sensor that you can crop images heavily and still have some nice images. And I've gotten 2 emails this week from people who basically asked if they are better off buying the 5DS and keeping their 70 to 200 millimeter lens because of its ability to crop heavily, or are they better off buying a 3 or a 400 millimeter telephoto lens and sticking with the same camera body that they already have. And going with the longer lens is the better option for many reasons. Cropping is never the answer. And I'm not somebody who says don't crop your images, but if you can avoid it at all, don't crop your images. It's always better to have the right piece of glass rather than trying to crop an image heavily. There's a lot of reasons why having the longer lens is going to be better. First of all, you're probably going to get more sharpness out of having the longer lens and not cropping. Secondly, by having, let's say, a 300 millimeter lens as opposed to a 200 millimeter lens, you're going to get more background blur. And then what, in my opinion, is the biggest issue is as you push your ISO up, that extra detail that is in the image is going to get lost. When you crop an image heavily, noise becomes more and more of an issue. And when I say noise, I'm not just talking about the grain in the image. I personally don't really care a lot about grain in my images. I know some people make a big deal about it being in the sky or in the shadows, whatever. It's not a big deal to me, but what bothers me is the loss of the fine detail in your image. And when you're cropping heavily and you're pushing your ISO up, you're basically going to defeat the purpose of having that higher megapixel sensor because you're going to lose that fine detail by having the higher ISO. And then on top of that, as you add noise reduction into the equation, you're going to lose even more detail. And so when you look at all of the sample shots that people are posting where they're cropping an image ridiculously, even the ones that I showed, they were shot at like ISO 100, ISO 200. By the time you start hitting ISO 400, you're basically going to start running into issues if you're trying to crop an image heavily. And the 5DS is not a bad performing low light camera. DxOMark just came out with their testing results of it. And I know that there's people who hate DxOMark and people who love it. I personally am not a huge fan of the site. But one of the imaging scores that does interest me is always their ISO performance results. And it basically came out, like I said, it's very comparable to the 5D Mark III in terms of low light performance. And the 5D Mark III is no slouch. It's not the best in the world, but it's not a bad camera either. So even though it's performing okay in low light, you're losing that detail as you get higher and higher. And I would say once you hit 400, and definitely by the time you start hitting ISO 800, your ability to crop the images heavily is pretty much going away very rapidly if it's not gone already. And in the real world, who really shoots at ISO 100 the majority of the time? I mean, yes, for sports and wildlife, and I'm not a big wildlife photographer, but yeah, I do shoot at ISO 100 sometimes, but especially for sports, I'm often shooting at 2, 4, 8, 1600, even high school football games, I'm shooting at 6400 unless I'm using a flash. So for shooting with sports and wildlife and event photography, where you have to constantly push that ISO, even if you're not pushing it to ridiculously high levels, you're losing that detail anyways. So the people who let's just stop and think about who really shoots at ISO 100. Commercial photographers doing like product photography, but there's no reason why they should have to crop heavily. They should be able to just get closer to the object if they need to. Portrait photography, I shoot at ISO 100 and I basically just get as close to the person as I want. I mean, I might have to crop a little bit here or there for composition, but not anything where I need a 50 megapixel camera. And, landscape photographers shoot a lot at ISO 100, but why would a landscape photographer really need to crop an image heavily either? So for anybody else who, the people who, in my opinion, really need the ability to crop wildlife, sports, and event photography, if you're pushing your ISO at all, you're going to have basically you're going to be defeating the purpose of having that high resolution sensor. And I wish that I had really clarified that in my initial review, because I think that it's something that people just keep thinking, oh, I'll just buy this and I'll just crop heavily. So I actually took this out to a softball game and shot with this, and it was getting late in the evening, and so I was pushing the ISO. So I'm going to show you guys these sample images. Now, I did shoot this with a Sigma 70 to 200 millimeter lens, not with the Canon. So yeah, the Sigma is not the sharpest in the world. Maybe with the Canon you might get a little bit more sharpness, but let's be realistic, it's not going to be a huge difference. I use the Sigma all the time, and I've used the Canon. Yes, the Canon's sharper, but it's not that big of a difference. So let's take a look here at these images. So here we start at ISO 800, and I've got the noise reduction up to 40. Let's turn that all the way down, and let's magnify this at a 3:1. And you can see all of the noise in there. You can see that you're losing all of that detail there, and with no noise reduction on. And now let's crank it up, and you can see how much more detail you're losing. That's at ISO 800. Let's skip the 1000. So now jump up to ISO 3200, and you know, your image is basically, once I updated my Lightroom catalog, this thing is just running, or updated Lightroom with the last update, it is going incredibly slow, and it's driving me nuts. It's eating up all the memory on my laptop, and I don't know what's going on. So anyway, so we're at ISO 3200, and you can see how much noise there is there. So let's turn the noise off, but you can see, look at how little detail there is at 3200. It's just, it's bad. And I mean, not that it's horrible. I mean, it performs comparably to other camera bodies out there, but your ability to crop these images heavily is gone. And you know, you can see all the way zoomed out, it looks relatively sharp, but once you try to crop heavily, you're gonna lose that detail. The other problem with cropping really heavily, especially for like sports and things like that, is you get an image, any imperfection in the image when you're cropping heavily is going to stand out, and stand out a lot. Any motion blur or any missed focus, if you're cropping heavily, it's going to look horrible. You can take a look at this picture here. You know, this was a low light situation, and the girl basically jumped straight away from me going back to make this catch. She actually made the catch. But you know, at a regular resolution, it looks relatively sharp. Obviously, if I blew this image up, it's going to look terrible. But let's take a look when you try to go in and crop. It's just horrible. The whole image falls apart. So if you're not tack on, if you've got any motion blur, if your focus misses just a little bit, your ability to crop heavily is gone anyways. So basically, my point is, the 5DS, even though it does give you the ability to crop heavily at low ISOs, I would not purchase it with the intention of depending on cropping images. It just kind of gives you that option. I think that more of what the camera is designed for isn't so much going to be cropping, but making large prints where you would be able to see that detail. So as far as being a sports camera, I mean, the 5DS is not a bad camera. It will perform adequately to photograph sports. I used it. It worked much like the 5D Mark III. The autofocus was fast and accurate, and you know, it performed just like a 5D Mark III. It's not bad, but I wouldn't go out and purchase it as a sports or wildlife camera with the intentions of cropping. So I hope that helps you guys out. If you guys have any questions for me, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.